morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. I certainly feel very honored to have this opportunity to share with you my research and my thinking in regard to science and engineering education in the U.S. today, because this is clearly of the utmost urgency and priority in our country and globally. I want to thank Larry for his thoughtful introduction. And in many ways, I would say that as I thought about my talk today, I really was reflecting on my most recent phone conversation with Larry, I guess a month or so ago, where he was really asking me to talk a little bit more about, well, how do you integrate these different parts of your Step 2 research grant? I mean, on the one hand, we're using statistical research, and we look at the effects of debt on STEM undergraduates' enrollment in graduate school. On another part of our study, we do case study, and we went to four-year institutions and community colleges, and we interviewed people. And then another big part of our work is to create what we call a STEM toolkit for Latinas and Latinos in STEM. So what's this toolkit business? Is that part of our research just the same as regression analysis and propensity score matching, case study and qualitative data? Where does a toolkit fit into that? In my mind, this is all perfectly integrated and unified, and it makes a lot of sense. But it's helpful for me to realize, well, that may not make sense to research communities, even one as interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary as this research community is. And so I want to talk a little bit today about the importance of action research in my work and why I believe that more broadly action research can and should be integrated into the research agenda for STEM education. Let me start by asking you a question. I'm interested to know, by show of hands, how many of you would describe yourself as a change agent? All right, well, then in many ways I'm talking or preaching to the choir, as they say. For those of you who did not raise your hand, if it was a really good gig and it was well compensated, good benefits, you got to meet interesting people, and to think in new and exciting ways and to envision a better world, who would be interested? Who thinks they might be persuaded to become a change agent? All right. Okay, I have some potential recruits here, so I'm pleased to know that. Okay. I'm looking to advance the slides. I'm going to hope for some carpe diem type thing to happen and that the slides will advance. Ah, there we go. Okay, thank you. All right, so I'm interested in how do we develop a social science of change and a social science of supporting and creating change agents. And all of you have some level of interest in being a change agent, whether you would characterize yourself that way now or that you would be willing to be acting as a change agent. Now, we're not alone in this. There have been many high-level national reports advocating for change in STEM education. One of the most recent was issued in May of last year, and it was called Preparing the Next Generation of STEM Innovators. I'll use some of the key recommendations of this report to frame my remarks. Okay. As Dan already mentioned, more recently we've had issued, the previous report was by the National Science Board. This is from the National Academies, and it was issued in the fall. It's coming out now as a book. And this report is very specifically focused not only on changing in new innovative ways of teaching in STEM and preparing teachers and ensuring graduates, but this report was specifically focused on underrepresented racial ethnic minority participation, expanding participation in STEM. And this report I'll refer to as the Talent at the Crossroads Report, or more briefly, the Crossroads Report. And I know tomorrow's speaker, Freeman Herbrowski, will, I'm sure, share his insights from having chaired this panel. This is a slide that I just picked up out of the Crossroads report, and it's focused on comparing the U.S. population by race and ethnicity in comparison to the science and engineering workforce. Now, at my center, the Center for Urban Education at USC, which I'm co-director with Estella Ben-Simon, we focus on racial and ethnic equity and outcomes in higher education. So I'm going to focus my remarks on these equity issues as we think about change and innovation in STEM. This probably doesn't surprise you if you've been attending to these high-level national reports, which have repeatedly been pointing out to us that we lack diversity in STEM, both in terms of race and ethnicity and in terms of gender and in terms of individuals with disabilities. But just to frame, our awareness, the Hispanic population, which is of course the largest growing or fastest growing demographic group in the U.S., is quite underrepresented in STEM fields. So that we have about a 5% representation in the science and engineering workforce, whereas in the U.S. population that proportion is 15%. If we were to focus just on the college-age population, Hispanics are now at 19%. I was driving the other day, going to work or something in LA, and I heard on the news that Latinos are now the largest demographic group among younger adults in California, or maybe it was in Southern California. And I thought, didn't we know that already? I thought that was pretty clear. But it must be that the new census data is out, and so it's clear that Latinos are the majority in California, and in other states, it's certainly a large portion of the population and growing. So I'm going to focus on Latino students or Hispanics. I'll use the terms interchangeably, although I know they're not. But we won't debate that. The reason I will do that is because our research grant focuses on pathways to STEM degrees for Latinos, but also because I think it's important to be specific when we talk about representation and diversity, to think about what groups are we talking about and which communities. In your work, you may be focused on African American students or Native Americans, and I think that the conversation, my remarks are still relevant to that thinking. Okay, I did move a couple of slides around a little bit based on what's in your packet. But I moved this one up just to frame again. When we think about education, obviously teachers and professors matter, and then of course doctorates matter. And so we've made some progress over the past couple of decades in terms of doctorates awarded to women in science and engineering, but less progress in regard to underrepresented minorities as a group. And so this has implications when we talk about change agents, that if we want to increase Latino participation and degree completion in STEM, this is not like a Latino issue. This is a social issue for all of us as change agents. This just represents the proportion of Hispanics in different occupations. So in all occupations, we see 14%. And then in these science and engineering occupations, you see declining rates as we get down to engineers, physicians, scientists, registered nurses, and post-secondary teachers. We're down at that 5% participation level. So this is the nature of the problem that we are interested in addressing and where we want to bring about change. And all of these high-level reports have really emphasized that this is very critical for the country. Rising Above the Gathering Storm is sort of one of the, I would say, landmark national reports in regard to STEM education, and it mobilized resources, it mobilized the executive branch and the legislative branch to increase appropriations, and this is possible around the diversity and equity agenda in STEM also, but I don't think that problem has really been engaged at the same level as the questions about human capital and innovation. So we need to think about ways to emphasize and to be problem solvers in regard to equity and diversity issues. So some of the Preparing the Next Generation report makes 3 key recommendations, what they call Keystone Recommendations. So the first one is to provide opportunities for excellence. This concerns teacher quality and ensuring access to AP classes, ensuring a rich curriculum, ensuring integration in the curriculum. The second one, it concerns casting a wide net, and the third one, fostering a supportive ecosystem. And these are the second and third points are ones that tie in with this question of acting as a change agent. So let's look a little more closely. So in regard to casting a wide net, the policy actions recommended in this report talk about improving talent assessment systems, enabling teachers, principals, counselors to be prepared to engage in this talent identification, and improving the identification of overlooked abilities. So essentially, if we really stop and think for a moment about what are these policy actions and what are we asking people to do when we make this policy recommendation, we're really asking, well, the way we do testing, the way we do assessment, the way we give quizzes in class, the way we decide who gets access to elite institutions, the way we decide who gets placed into non-credit basic skills classes. Like, these are our talent identification systems, and this report is asking us to rethink those. Whether you are in admissions or you teach or you're directing programs, this would really go to the heart of the way we do business. And so asking people to identify talent in new ways really is asking them to change. Fostering a supportive ecosystem. The policy actions include a campaign to appreciate academic excellence. For 10 years, my role was I was a media manager. I did communications and marketing, so I appreciate a good marketing campaign, and I think actually this is very important. And I do some marketing in my day job myself when it comes to promoting the work that we do at the center and our mission and vision around equity. So the notion that scientists should be at the White House, as we reach the end of March Madness, right alongside whichever basketball team wins, I think that's a good idea. Yeah, we need to do that. Other wise recommendations of this report, professional development for educators in STEM pedagogy. This is really essential, right? If you want people to change, to not teach the way I was taught, to not believe that the system in which I was a winner is not a good system, you need new training. You need to be retrained. And I'll hold my hand up. I need to be retrained. We are teaching and administering programs in culturally and linguistically complex environments. This may or may not have been the type of environment in which we were educated. So we need to learn new ways and to be very intentional about doing that. So I think that's an important recommendation. It goes on to talk about professional development and also conferences to explore best practices, which I think, as we saw from Dowd's presentation, is a big part. You'll be sharing good ideas. And so, hey, we can check. Let's put a check mark because we're on top of that. Okay. So to talk about a social science of change and change agents, let me say that this question of change and how do people become motivated to actually change their own environment, to change their own culture, this is sort of a, age-old question for social scientists, right? And so we want to ask, how do individuals become motivated to change their practices and policies when they are embedded in those practices and policies, and in fact they may be, as culture is, sort of completely invisible to us in many ways. And what leads people to become change agents? Because it may or may not come with good compensation benefits. That part I wasn't sure about, but being in with a really good group of people, that's to my experience, that's true. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the research we've been doing and what I've learned through that research in regard to this question of acting as change agents and creating a social science to study change agents and to promote them. I'll draw on research that has been funded by the NSF, where we did case studies, we used mixed methods, and we did rich case sampling. So we were looking for exemplars. To say that we did rich case sampling and that we were looking at exemplars is not the same as saying the people in our case study are exemplary. That would be a different sort of thing. But our strategy was, we want to understand how to support, motivate, and facilitate change. Let's go and look at people who rise to the top through rich case sampling as very likely to be informative in regard to this question. So we used a three-part strategy: multiple regression. We looked at the institutional level, and we just did looked at the residuals and looked and saw, okay, which institution seems to be performing above the mean. And so we had a small sample of overperformers. We focused on states with large Hispanic populations. we looked at those overperformers and went to their websites. We basically said, where's the action? You know, whose website suggests to us that, you know, they've got the federal funding to be bringing about new and innovative ideas, and that they're focused on their Latino students also. We also look to see where are individuals focused on the transitions or articulation between community colleges and four-year institutions. And because when we talk about Latino students, community colleges are very, very important because you have 60% of Latinos starting out on their studies in community colleges. We also focus on Hispanic serving institutions because, again, HSIs are extremely important to think about the increase of STEM bachelor's degrees or doctorates among individuals of Hispanic descent, because although HSIs are only a very small portion of overall colleges and universities in the United States, at about 8%, about 50% of Latinos are in HSIs. So we have a concentration of Latinos in Hispanic serving institutions. HSIs are awarding 40% of the bachelor's degrees to Latino students. Yet in the STEM field, that portion falls only to 20%. So this tells us that there's capacity in HSIs to produce more Latino graduates in STEM. So we went to 6 HSIs, 3 four-year institutions, and 3 of their community colleges. I'm saying we, let me credit where credit is due. Estela Ben-Simon is my co-director at the Center for Urban Education. She's also the co-principal investigator on our research grant, and she led this case study component. We have been collaborating very closely with Ricardo Stanton Salazar, who is a sociologist, for that table of sociologists, and for Larry, let me point out he is a sociologist, and he was part of our research group. We met weekly, bi-weekly, and we drew on theories of institutional agents that he has developed, and I'll say more about that as I go on. Lindsay Malcolm, who was one of my doctoral students, now a professor at UC Riverside, collaborated with us, and we had a number of research assistants at our center also engaged in this research. Okay, so just to talk a little bit about the mission of my center, Center for Urban Education. Our purpose is to conduct what we call socially conscious research, and to develop the tools needed for institutions of higher education to bring about equity in higher education. So this notion of developing tools is rooted in this action research agenda and in this agenda of a social science to study and to promote the creation of change agents. We use many theoretical approaches and perspectives in our work. I won't talk about them. I did note sociology already. Larry is my program officer, so let's start with sociology, very important field. But our work is informed also by methodological considerations in action research, action science, what's called practice theory. Practice theory is essentially theories about how do people become experts? How do you become an expert practitioner? Very important question, especially going back to what the National Science Board is calling for. Basically they're asking for people to develop expertise in new ways. Organizational learning, critical theory. Critical theory, while it sounds critical, like that can't be good, critical theory is actually pretty helpful. Critical theory points out that in the U.S. we have a history of racism, we have a history of discrimination. We know that discrimination was institutionalized in higher education. We're some decades from formal and legal discrimination, but critical theory says, but what are the lingering effects of that, and what are the contemporary forms? How has that history become embedded in our institutional structures? And it's practical in the sense of saying, so let's pay attention to that, let's talk about that, because if we leave those histories and legacies invisible, we are not going to bring about equity and diversity in STEM or more broadly in society. Psychology is also informing our work, particularly as we think about evaluation of our tools. Okay, I mentioned Ricardo Stanton Salazar has been collaborating with us. And we, in doing our case study research, started with his theory of institutional agents, which is basically a network analytical theory based in the study of social capital. And institutional agents, as he defines it, high status, non-kin individuals who provide key forms of social and institutional support to enable, whether it's minority students, low-income students, women in certain cases, so what he would say low-status youth, to negotiate educational institutions to acquire the institutional support they need to tap highly valued resources, opportunities, privileges, and services. So the institutional agent term is applied to individuals who are acting, who have authority, who have power, and use that knowledge, power, and authority on behalf of low-status youth. So key here also is they have a critical consciousness. Critical consciousness means, people who are active in thinking about, well, what are the structures I'm working within? What are the legacies? What are the histories that have defined this culture, defined our talent identification systems, define what we know as merit, and how we think about appropriate methods for selecting, sort of scientists, engineers, mathematicians, and assigning people slots in higher education or in education in general. So our approach was deductive. Ricardo's work had already appeared in the book Manufacturing Hope and Despair, also in a Harvard Educational Research journal article in 1997, in which he really had already elaborated theories of institutional agents. And then he, in working with us, thought more about the higher education context. And in higher education, structures play a big role because we have very complicated and multi-layered structures in higher ed. And so that led him to actually develop new forms, new thinking about institutional support. And it generated this list of 14 institutional agent role types, and he has just recently published an article in Youth and Society, which you can read to learn all about in detail these 14 types. But I'll illustrate some of them as I move forward here, but one of the aspects of the work that I wanted to draw out right off the bat is that acting as an institutional agent in some ways is like being a mentor. So it's, if we look at NSF's guidelines for grants, it really encourages mentoring. Like mentoring is institutionalized within the way that we think about what's important for creating diversity and equity in STEM. So mentoring is something that's considered, that's part of our talent identification system. We're doing it. So we sort of have that institutionalized because it's expected even within, sort of the call for proposals, and it's expected as to how we're going to go about bringing about diversity. So the notion of institutional agents, when we look at these different forms, such as advisor, advocate, networking coach, knowledge agent, these roles are similar to the mentoring role. Cultural guide, also similar to mentoring. And so these first two forms of institutional support, direct support and integrative support, are in many ways like mentoring. But institutional agents go beyond mentoring to changing the system. So if mentoring is a process of helping Latinos or African Americans or Native Americans become assimilated into the science and engineering culture, the role of institutional agents is actually to change that system. And that's what these reports are calling for. So this work is relevant to how do people learn to do that work of changing the system. And the notion of systems developer, someone who's actually going to redesign systems, and of creating system linkage emerged through our case study analyses. Okay, now I mentioned that we created a STEM toolkit, and the way that we went about doing this is we looked at our case study analyses, and we did the typical kinds of thematic analysis where we grouped, derived themes. Ricardo Stanton Salazar led our analysis in the use of Spradley's domain analysis, so generating themes, categories, and then testing them with our data repeatedly in a process that was both deductive and inductive. And from that, we generated those themes and findings, but then we took it a step farther, and this is that action research component that I mentioned earlier. We took it a step farther, and we created stories. And the purpose of creating these stories, such as, for example, our story of Professor Manuel Diaz, a professor of biochemistry who teaches at a 4-year HSI. He's a Mexican-American male, and he's taught at the university for 15 years. So if you go to our center's website and you look at our STEM toolkit, you'll see this story of Manuel Diaz. And he's sort of a composite of characteristics that stood out through our analysis as to what characterizes change agents. In each of the, there are actually 4 different vignettes or stories that appear of change agents through our STEM toolkit. And, they each depict different kinds of roles. And so in the case of Professor Diaz, we show him acting as a bridging agent, as a cultural guide, as an integrative agent, networking coach, and advocate. And so we show him, for example, going with a student, a graduate student, taking to a professional research conference, introducing that student to valuable contacts, et cetera, et cetera. So this is all in some ways familiar to you, I think, as you think about the mentoring role, but the key is using one's own resources to tap students into those valuable networks. We have another depiction based on our study of Luis Martinez, and in this case, he's really acting in a different way entirely. He's not doing that one-on-one direct mentoring and coaching. He's developing programs. He's going to the community college. He's asking his faculty to engage in meetings with community college faculty, really in ways that sort of change the rules of status, of the curriculum, of articulation, of how people spend their time. And he's doing that because he recognizes that the Latino students are in the community college. And so to bring about diversity and equity in STEM and to do this new form of talent identification needs to create new programs. And many of you are creating new programs, so I know you're innovators in this area, and you're already acting as change agents. So some of what you'll share is how do you go about doing that? Another vignette depicts someone acting as a lobbyist, lobbying for resources. I won't go through all of these. Another, Sarah Gardner. This is someone who's in a counseling role. And we think of counselors rightly as doing one-on-one support for students. And much of what is depicted here in this vignette depicts that. But in addition, Sarah Gardner is someone who thinks about how do I actually change the kinds of programs, structures that are provided to our students in order to change the system, not just help them navigate a difficult system. And the findings are actually depicted through the use of questions. So the idea would be to actually sit with colleagues, preferably in interdisciplinary and cross-functional teams, to ask each other, well, are we doing these things? Who are we relying on to be the system developer, to be the program developer, or the coordinator? Is it that one person? If it's one person, one Latino in an engineering department, that person will get burnt out. Our data shows that. This is, again, social and collective responsibility, and the use of tools such as vignettes or other forms of data analyses are intended to bring about this kind of a reflective practice that asks about institutional responsibility, collective responsibility. This just is sort of a depiction of the different role types. I'm going to move on past there. Okay, now I talked about action research, and I talked about it as part of comprehensive strategies of research. So research and social science research is about creating knowledge that's useful for social problems. And so I want to think for a little bit with you about, well, what are the sources of knowledge? And Aristotle tells us, and when I say that, it's not that I've been talking to Aristotle, and it's not even that I've been reading Aristotle's works, but Aristotle tells us in ways that have been really integrated into the action research methodology that there are 3 forms of life tasks, and there are 3 forms of knowledge necessary to carry out those life tasks. And I think that these 3 forms of knowledge and 3 forms of life tasks are really essential to implementing the recommendations of these reports. So the first life task is theorizing, and it requires epistemic knowledge. So theorizing is thinking about universal truths, eternal truths, and reaching generalized principles that explain the natural world. And so epistemic knowledge is really sort of a formalized knowledge, mathematical knowledge, logical models, and these models generate knowledge that is thought to be universal. And that's, epistemic is probably a word most familiar in our everyday use. The other life task is building things, reproducing things, and a craft knowledge about how do we actually be creative, productive, and reproductive. And so building requires what's called techne knowledge. And so that sounds a little bit like technical. and there are some similarities there, but technique knowledge actually refers also to what you're doing when you share ideas about how do we build a good program, an effective program. Okay, so the third form of knowledge and the third life task. So the third life task is doing the good, and this is called praxis. And praxis requires frenetic knowledge. And frenetic or phronesis, these are not everyday words, and so sometimes that's translated as practical wisdom. And practical wisdom is a form of knowledge that helps us make decisions in communities. It's deliberative, it's collaborative, and so in the first picture there, I'm representing sort of a governing body, a collective circle for decision making. In the lower image, I'm evoking a teacher with young children, and the reason for that is the second meaning of phronesis or practical wisdom is the notion of a responsiveness and to individualizing. So it's knowledge and wisdom that's individualized. In effect, the opposite of epistemic knowledge. So this the generalizing versus particularizing knowledge and using particular knowledge for teaching or for collective decision making. Now, it's important to emphasize it's not to say one of these forms of knowledge is better than another, but the point that I think is very relevant to the task before us today when we talk about diversity in STEM is that there's different status assigned to different kinds of knowledge. So epistemic knowledge, technique knowledge, so these are of higher status than phronesis or frenetic knowledge or practical wisdom. Practical wisdom sounds a bit soft, whereas theoretical knowledge is of a higher status. Particularly if we think about scientists, mathematicians, so their knowledge, their expertise is really built on these fundamental principles that are evoked through mathematical knowledge. So if we ask people to change and do things differently, we're asking them to give up some of their resource base, some of their expertise, and to enter into a realm, this use of frenetic knowledge and practical wisdom, in which they have less expertise. And so as we think about professional development and really making professional development central and as critical to this process as best practices, the technique knowledge, which truly is necessary to build better programs, we need to really think about how do we support people when we're asking them to enter into a world where they're actually giving up a little bit of their expertise and authority. I included a series of slides for the purpose of just really thinking about, well, what is the nature of the problem to which I'm advocating we use a combination of technique knowledge and frenetic knowledge. And it's this ongoing lack of representation, lack of participation of minority students in STEM fields. I don't think you can probably read this in detail, but you can see the flatness of the lines, right? And so for all underrepresented minorities from 2000 to 2008, we see sort of flat representation in science and engineering bachelor's degrees. If we start to look more specifically at Hispanics and degrees awarded, we see the growth in the red line, the top line of non-science and engineering degrees, but much lower or flatter growth in science and engineering fields. And so the question is, how do we create, have that blue line have the same slope as the red line, or even higher for both of them, really? So, this slide, I think, is probably difficult to see in its details, but you see that within the STEM fields, social sciences is the top line, the blue one. Psychology is next. So we see those two fields graduating more Hispanic students, but the engineering, computer sciences, math, physical sciences, these areas are really not being able to generate graduates in the same rate. Here we see for enrollment in the engineering programs. Well, engineering seems to, as was mentioned earlier, we're not having enough graduates in engineering programs in general. We have engineers here, so they can inform this in terms of some of those issues. But we don't see Latino students graduating with engineering degrees. This is just another way of looking at that, but now in terms of a trend line. So I mentioned earlier that I thought, well, it's very important to think about these issues in terms of communities and in terms of specific needs, social needs, as well as scientific needs. And so I'm from Southern California, so when I think about engineers and engineering, and I think about the fact that Latinos are the largest demographic group among young people, then I really want Latinos in my community to be engaged in engineering, because there are huge engineering problems in Southern California. I mean, just think about water, for example, a very pressing issue. Transportation, energy. We're actually meeting today on a really somber day, and when we think about energy, we will need to make choices as a society as to how we're going to have the fuel to fuel our modern economy. We've already seen the Gulf, so offshore drilling, nuclear energy, wind power, all of these carry costs and benefits. So engineering is a social, the social science of engineering is as critical to us as the science of engineering. Part of this disaggregates degrees awarded to Hispanics in science and engineering by type of degree. So the red line shows the growth in bachelor's degrees when those degrees are aggregated, and the lower lines are associate's degrees, master's degrees, and doctorates. And we already saw earlier, that doctorates are not growing, and associate's degrees are not growing either. And this, I think, reflects the tremendous problem of math education in K-12. And we see that in community colleges also. And so the rates of success are very low in the math curriculum in community colleges. It's nearly impossible to move from a community college with an associate's degree and earn an engineering degree. And we see that in our data when we examine for Latino students. If we look HSI, community college, non-HSI, transfers. If you've earned an associate's degree and you transfer to an HSI or even a non-HSI, you're very, very unlikely to get an engineering degree. So this is this is a real problem. It's a practical problem. We need technical knowledge to build some systems that would provide degrees to students in ways that that would work. But we'd also need that kind of practical wisdom that says this is the situation that needs to be addressed if we wish to achieve the goals. This slide represents that individuals on visas, temporary residents, are filling our higher education programs in STEM. So in doctoral degrees, we see temporary residents, which is the green line, growing, whereas Latino students remaining flat. Okay, so I talked about action research as a form of research that's necessary in order to reach these goals. I drew on some of these trend lines and some of the statistics that were generated when we looked at the National Survey of Recent College Graduates, and we looked at it disaggregated for Latinos. The trends are important to help us understand that a problem exists, but to bring it home closer so that people say, this is my problem, that requires a different kind of knowledge production. Right? So we can identify trends, patterns, truths of how our systems are operating. We can generate technique knowledge about, well, if we did mentoring better, if we changed the way we design this articulation agreement, we might do better. But what's essential is that the problem be viewed as a problem of practice by individual practitioners. So this is the key when we talk about a science of praxis or a science of change. Is how do people become motivated to change their own practices in their own world when they're experts at doing it the way they do it, as opposed to the way they might be asked to do. So I include here an example. At the center, we created a tool which is a review of syllabi. And while this might seem like a rather simple thing to do, we found that by bringing cross-functional teams, counselors and faculty and administrators together and looking at syllabi, that it actually can lead to what the practice theorists call an indeterminate situation. An indeterminate situation is when you say, these are my goals, this is what I'm trying to achieve, here's how I'm doing it, and it's not working. And now I'm going to be very deliberate to do inquiry and to collect data to figure out how am I going to change that situation. So we actually use syllabi as a form of data. And we had groups of teams, evidence teams, look at this data. And one of our community college math faculty members noticed, well, when I look at my syllabus, I see teaching pre-algebra, okay? I'm teaching pre-algebra, and I realize that I've explained to the students how to calculate their grades using an algebraic formula. So if you want to do talent assessment and talent development, it's a little discouraging to that student in the community college in a pre-algebra course to have to try to sort out, well, how am I going to be graded? How will I be assessed when that's expressed as an algebraic formula? Because obviously they're not familiar with that yet. That's why they're in your class. So this cartoon was actually selected by a member of that evidence team at that college to represent this sort of gotcha nature of the pedagogy that was represented in that data. And that became a point of reflection in that team. And they shared this at a symposium we held. I wasn't the first one to say this about that reflective practice that they engaged in. And the finger coming out, no, wrong again, speaks to, I think, what you're probably familiar with about weed out courses and just a disposition towards students. So to move past thinking the problems that we see in these data are problems of student deficits to the problems that we see in these data are problems of practice. That is the key that as a social scientist, I'm thinking more about how do we go about creating those conditions for change. And that I would invite you to think about, in your work, whether you are a change agent or you're one of those aspiring change agents. The last phase then is like, well, how would we know if having a team of people look at their syllabi as data actually lead to change? So through the past several years, we've been collecting case study data, and I'm now working on developing valid survey evaluation forms to understand what is the impact of working with teams of people in an action research, action inquiry model. What is the impact on their beliefs, on their practices, on their dispositions, on their willingness to engage in new practices. And this diagram depicts a psychological model of change. And I won't go through it, but clearly one's individual characteristics, the social environment in which you act, the kind of information that you have. All of these are factors that will drive what you believe to be the right action, what you believe is expected of you through the norm, what's the norm, and whether or not what's called control beliefs, you actually have the power, authority, ability to act as a change agent. These are all drivers. But environmental constraints, those structures of higher ed that I mentioned earlier, can play a huge role in keeping even those individuals who wish to act as change agents from enacting change. So I showed you the syllabus summary of the gotcha cartoon. I know that one of those math faculty members was asked by someone at the college, I'm going to a conference and I wanted to report on the work we've been doing with CUE, the Center for Urban Ed. What should I tell them? And he said, well, tell them I opened my heart. I thought, wow, that is wonderful impact data. He told her, tell them I opened my heart, which meant I've changed my way of looking at my students and thinking about my students and thinking about their success or lack of success. And so I thought, that's really great. And then a year later, I find out, well, he didn't actually change his syllabus. So it tells me I have more work to do. And I was back at that college last week. And it also tells me, though, that this business is pretty complicated. And that's why I wanted to talk with you about it and to say, I think this is a social science that involves university researchers, it involves program directors, it involves community college faculty. This is a social science that actually draws on these multiple forms of knowledge and that asks us to integrate them to bring about the equity and diversity that these reports envision. So I could say more about our developmental evaluation work, but let me, I think this would be a good time to stop and take some questions. Here, let me go back to thank you. I was trying to go back to the cartoon. Oh, oops. Wow, okay. All right, do I have a...
So there are two microphones here, so everyone who's not listening, please come up and use the microphone and identify yourself. studying the University of Memphis, and I noticed that there's two types of knowledge. The one word that we use is empirical. How does that empirical, by the experiment, find that result fit into the scheme of things?
Okay. So empirical as in based on data, based on observation.
Right, like laboratory science. We think something's true, we design an experiment and test it.
Okay. And so after you do the experiment and you do the test, then you reach a conclusion that's generalizable. Okay. So empiricism is certainly associated with phonetic knowledge, epistemic knowledge, eternal truths, and generalization. Observational data is also very relevant to how do we figure out if something's effective. So that's the technique knowledge. And empiricism and observation is also important to the creation of practical wisdom because it's a use of data in our own practices. So empiricism, empirical data is important to all three forms of knowledge. Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Hi, Norman Hips from St. Vincent College in Pennsylvania. There are two questions. One is the stories that you have of individual, if you call success individuals. Is that intended to serve as a motivating story? Is it intended that these individual cases will be studied to assess how they came, where they arrived? The second question is that data point about students being unsuccessful in going from a community college to a four-year college in engineering. What kind of conclusions get drawn from that piece of data?
Okay, thank you. The vignettes of institutional agents in action were written for the purpose of creating models, as I mentioned, exemplars. And the purpose there is to suggest ways of doing business that don't exist widely in the way we do business today. So if action research asks participants to think about how do we change our culture, change our practices, part of what needs to be possible is to envision something different. And when we're embedded in our own culture and the way we do business is, the way, it's sometimes hard to envision other ways. So we drew on our data to identify exemplars that we felt could be used like sort of a benchmark in terms of practice, like a model by which to compare the way we're doing business and say, well, I know NSF calls on people to do mentoring, and now we know that professional development is important. So part of the question is going to be, how are we going to do that professional development? Like, what is that model going to look like? And this inquiry piece, I think, is very important within that professional development model, because the intention is to ask practitioners who are experts to reflect on their practice in deliberate ways using data. So the vignettes were intended as a prompt to data collection. Your second question was in regard to engineering programs and the transitions between community colleges and four-year institutions and bachelor's degree completion. What should we draw from that? My understanding of it, and others here probably know better, is that the engineering curriculum is highly rigorous and structured, and as you complete an associate's degree in a community college and you move on to a four-year institution, you're behind. It's just you can't get in step with the curriculum. So that example, I think, really stands out in my mind because it's really an area where we would have to change the way we do business in really hard ways. But yet if we have the students there and these are our goals, then that's something we can be deliberate and use an inquiry model to think about how to go about changing that. I can hear you.
You observed earlier in your talk that in higher education, institutional structure is an important consideration in achieving effective action research and I guess in my observation, I would say that's probably true of the whole educational system. And what I've observed as a program officer is the challenge that a lot of these projects have to take on when they're dealing with students coming out of K-12 systems that aren't completely effective It seems, at least from the faculty's perspective, to elongate the challenge they have to deal with in order to bring students up to a standard where they could conceivably succeed in STEM. I'm curious about your change agent action research model, whether it would embrace increasing connections between higher education and the K-12 system.
Sorry, excuse me. Whether it would embrace connections between higher ed and the K-12 system. Okay. That's a great question. You know, early, like 5 years ago, when we went to community colleges to do work in regard to equity and action research using various action research tools, one of the things we would really ask participants to do was to say, you know, it's kind of human nature to say, well, the problems are out there. And so we would ask, let's set aside K-12 because we're here. If we want to bring about change, what can we change here at home, right? And you know, we can all ask that question. I ask it in my work also. But what we really see in the community college data is the tremendous challenges facing community colleges of doing non-credit developmental or basic skills education. So I do feel that that's part of the fundamental changing of the way we do business is greater articulation and professional development across sectors of teachers, of community college faculty, and of four-year university teaching faculty as well as research faculty. So I do think that that is important and necessary. One of the responses that community colleges have had to the lack of mathematics success for K-12 students is to create a longer and longer basic skills or a remedial curriculum pipeline. That solution, the data shows us again and again and again, is not working because there are too many milestones, too many gates, and too many students are lost at every milestone gatekeeper point. So that's really a technique kind of question. How do we build this differently? The thing we built is not working. So let's build it differently. And there's some interesting work going on there to address that.
Austin Ferguson, Olive Harvey College, working with Chicago State. Don't you think, it's a comment, that scientists, hardcore scientists, should have a strong background in social science? Because if they have a balance in social science looks at the whole globe, the whole picture, whereas individual scientists look at from a narrow lens. So if they have a strong background in social science, they'll understand self-reflection. Who am I? And there was a gentleman around 1500 said, well, if everybody in this room that don't have a bias, everybody in this room that has a bias, please raise your hand. Very few people raise their hand. If he asked everybody in this room who has a bias, raise your hand, he said, you can go home because all of us are biased. So self-reflection is extremely important. And sometimes we become so entrenched in what we are, we fail to see the whole picture. And I think that's one of the problems. The last thing is that selectivity in four-year universities, students come in already prepared. Community colleges now, since the standards have changed, the students are not prepared. So mentorship is important. Also learning how to study in orientation. Do you agree? Yes or no?
Yes.
So I'm not on the wrong page, right?
A+.
That's what I do with mentoring. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. You do remind me, if I have another minute, to just address. So one of the things I think is really important in doing this research, I mentioned we had this research team. So Estela Ben-Simon is an expert in case study research and qualitative data analysis. Lindsay Malcolm is a wonderful statistical methodologist. And the three of us work together across these elements. And I feel like I have this wonderful team, and I'm tapping these different forms of knowledge. I'm tapping these different kinds of research. One person can't do it all, right? So it's necessary to develop one's expertise. So if engineers are focused on engineering, hey, I'm not going to criticize. They've got to focus on engineering, and they need that coursework. So it's really a team, a collaborative strategy that's necessary, such that different forms of knowledge are respected. I think it's the issue of our culture assigning certain kinds of knowledge more status than other forms of knowledge. And so there are phases of one's career, phases of developing expertise, and as we establish our expertise, we establish our careers, these are opportunities to really look at how am I going to be collaborative, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, such that I can tap these different forms of knowledge in a truly integrated way. Not write a grant that's statistical and then say, well, maybe I should throw in some case studies. So, so that's my last editorial on forms of research. And I see Dan is like waving at me, which I think means... okay.
I was just looking at the time. It's 10:15. Someone wants to ask a quick question, but I would like to call it to a close and just after this, okay?
Thanks. Sue Tapero, I'm from a community college and in California, where we have an awful lot of them.
My neighbor.
Yes. I would really like to see the data that you showed about the engineering students trying to transfer broken out by whether the community colleges got a real 2-year a lower division engineering program or not. I know that there's wide variation among community colleges about how much resource is devoted to the first 2 years of education in our STEM majors. And I know that the faculty in those areas are probably always arguing and lobbying to do a better job there. We have a really robust record because we have a good 2-year program, and I think that makes all the difference.
Yeah.
So I'd like to see it broken out. That would be interesting to me.
I think it would be interesting. And so back to arguing and lobbying, back to that, the National Science Board calling on that communications campaign. I think as change agents, part of this will be arguing for the value of public education. So let me turn it back. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your attention. Thank you.
I want to thank you, Alicia, for showing us that research involves still Greek philosophy, mathematics, sociology, and the physical sciences, and practice, as you were saying. So I want to thank you very much. And as a gift from Susan Hickson, from, I believe this is from Australia to California, a bottle of Shiraz. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'll meet you later.